Good day. As you can see from the background to this video, I am now in the English countryside and I am on leave with my family. And obviously, during the period of my leave, I have to give my family a certain degree of priority over work matters. So this is inevitably going to affect my output and probably, at least to a great extent, the length of my videos. Nonetheless, I do intend to continue to provide coverage every day, to do a video every day, and I will continue to do videos with Alex. I will keep everybody informed, and as I said, my output will continue over the course of the next couple of days, though, as I said, the length of my programs will probably be less. Some people, of course, will probably give a sigh of relief for that. But anyway, where are we? Where are we today? That's Sunday, the 25th of May. Well, as I said in my program yesterday, we are in a limbo period between the meeting between the Russians and the Ukrainians on the 16th of May in Istanbul, and the next meeting. Yesterday, a Russian senator, a member of the Russian Federation Council, said that the Russians have almost completed their memorandum, setting out their own ideas of what a settlement of the conflict should be, and that they expect to communicate it to the Ukrainians at some point within the next couple of days. As I said in my program yesterday, there is no word at all of whether the Ukrainians are preparing or working on a plan of their own. President Zelensky, has previously said that the only matter that his officials are tasked with dealing with in the negotiations with the Russians are steps towards agreeing a ceasefire, a 30-day unconditional ceasefire, followed by an unlimited unconditional ceasefire. They're not prepared to discuss, according to Zelensky, anything else. So my own guess, which I said yesterday, is that the Ukrainians will treat the Russian memorandum when it arrives as setting out unacceptable demands. That is a given. They will say that it is a type of ultimatum to themselves. They will reject it outright. They will then put forward, at best, a simple document demanding an unconditional ceasefire, probably couched in identical terms to the document that was presented in Paris about a month ago, which was worked out by the Ukrainians alongside the Europeans. And that is all that they will do. And they will tell the Europeans, their friends in Europe, and they will tell the Americans that the Russian demands are so unreasonable that Ukraine cannot be expected to agree to them. And that will be, as far as the Ukrainians are concerned, probably the end of the negotiations. Whether the United States presses the Ukrainians to agree to a further meeting with the Russians after these exchanges remains to be seen. President Trump has previously indicated that he does wish this to happen, but the Ukrainians and the Europeans, as night follows day, are going to tell the Americans that the Russian demands are so unreasonable that there is no point in a discussion of any kind between the Ukrainians and the Russians, a further discussion taking place unless and until the Russians supposedly are forced to come to the table by the Americans imposing massive sanctions against the Russians, which, as I have said in previous programs, actually means massive sanctions on countries that trade with Russia, China, India, and countries like that. So I think this is where we actually are. I think that is the Ukrainian game plan. There are reports that the Americans are working, that some Americans at least are working with the Ukrainians on their response. My guess is that they are the Americans that we can assume are working hard to help the Ukrainians, to assist the Ukrainians take this hardline position. People like Kellogg, perhaps Rubio, Lindsey Graham certainly, and of course the British, the French, the Germans will all be active and busy trying to do all of these things. And essentially the plan is to bring the Americans, to bring Donald Trump back to the position that he faced on the 11th of May, to be precise, when the European leaders, Macron, Starmer, Tusk, and Merz, went to Kiev, and they published a joint ultimatum with Zelensky, threatening the Russians with bone-crunching sanctions unless they agreed to an unconditional ceasefire within 2 days, and claiming that they had the support of the United States in making that ultimatum. That ultimatum failed when Putin proposed direct negotiations and Donald Trump agreed. But I suspect that the entire objective of Ukrainian and European diplomacy at the present time is to bring us directly back to that point. So that's my underlying summary of the situation at the present time. And as I discussed in my program yesterday, the Russians are focused instead on conducting the war, and I will turn to that shortly over the course of this program. However, in the meantime, we are having some rather strange things going on in the background. Firstly, there are reports that the Americans, or some people in the United States, these reports come from Bloomberg, so that they are presumably to be taken seriously, that some people in the United States, unclear who, are trying to persuade the Russians to change their chief negotiator. They consider Vladimir Medinsky to be too hardline, and they want him to be replaced with someone else. That's according to Bloomberg. Now, there are so many things to say about this. Firstly, the idea that the United States should have a role in picking the Russian negotiating team in negotiations in which the United States, to end a conflict in which the United States has been, as the New York Times itself confirms, a direct party in the conflict with Russia, which the negotiations are intended to end. In other words, that the Americans should be choosing the other side's negotiators, is, to say it simply, utterly and completely bizarre. It is strange when a third party tries to choose the other side's negotiators and other parties' negotiators in any kind of negotiation. But it is exceptionally bizarre in this case. But in any event, the entire premise upon which this American move, if it really is happening, is based, that Medinsky is a hardliner and a hawk and is an inflexible and tough negotiator who needs to be removed and replaced with somebody who's softer and milder than him. I think most people in Russia would find that absolutely staggering, because the consensus in Russia about Medinsky is almost the diametric opposite, that he's not a particularly strong negotiator, that he's not particularly experienced in negotiations, that he was appointed chief negotiator back in 2022, in February 2022, when the first negotiations took place between Russia and Ukraine, and his purpose then was simply to carry out Vladimir Putin's orders, and that he wasn't in any serious way conducting the negotiations at all. And frankly, if Medinsky were to be removed as chief negotiator, the Americans perhaps, and the Ukrainians perhaps, need to be very careful. It's a good example of, being careful what you wish for, because if Medinsky is replaced by a different negotiator, that different negotiator could turn out to be a much tougher, much more hardline character, much more experienced negotiator than is Medinsky himself. I think, this is my own personal view, that far from trying to remove Medinsky, the Americans ought to be telling the Ukrainians, let's keep him there, because whilst Medinsky is leading the negotiations for the Russians, it's a sign that Putin himself is personally and directly involved. He is, by some distance, the most measured Russian official involved in the conflict in Ukraine, at least in terms of the language he uses. And given that that is the case, let us not by any means try and distance Putin from the negotiations, which could very well result in a much more hardline figure taking charge and Putin himself moving further into the background. Just saying. Anyway, that's one thing that is really strange. There is something else which is happening, and now I apologise because, of course, I'm talking a little bit about my own country, which is Britain, and that is that the Financial Times, for an extraordinary length of time, I think in excess of 24 hours, was leading with a very, very strange story, and it relates to the arson attacks on properties connected to the British Prime Minister, Keir Starmer. And the article, the title of the article, which, as I said, to repeat again, which was something like 24 hours, the lead story on the Financial Times' website. Its title is UK investigates possible Russian involvement in Starmer Arson attacks. Counter-terrorism police looking into fires at properties connected to Prime Minister keep open mind about motives. And we then go on to read, British security officials are investigating whether Russia may be involved in 3 arson attacks on properties connected to Sir Keir Starmer, according to senior Whitehall figures. So that suggests someone who is pretty high up in the British government is feeding this information to the Financial Times. We're told that prosecutor Sarah Brybilska has said in court that the alleged conspiracy is currently unexplained. Counter-terrorism police leading the investigation are keeping an open mind about motive. We're then told that Russia has ramped up a campaign of sabotage and violence across Europe over the past 18 months as Moscow's war against Ukraine has raged on and Western nations have squeezed the Russian economy with sanctions. And we're then told, and this gets stranger and stranger, even if British officials conclude the arson attacks originate in Russia, that would not necessarily mean they were ordered by the Kremlin or that the suspects were aware of any Russian involvement. That is very strange. So, Putin would not know about it, and it seems that not only would Putin not know about it, but the people who actually carried out the attacks, they too would not know about any of this either. I mean, what really is any of this actually all about? Well, I'm not going to, as I said previously, as I discussed previously in other programs, trying to preempt this negotiation. But as I said, it all looks extremely strange to me. And frankly, as far as I'm concerned, it makes absolutely no sense. No sense at all. So I'm just publishing all of this. It seems that the article, by the way, goes on to say that one of the perpetrators of these attacks, all three of them are Ukrainians, or at least have Ukrainian backgrounds. One of them has Romanian citizenship. Anyway, it seems that one of these people has published pictures on social media which strongly endorse Ukraine in the conflict and appear to show favorably Ukrainian soldiers. To repeat again, the Financial Times tells us that Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin might know nothing about these attacks having any Russian connection, that the perpetrators themselves might know nothing about these attacks having a Russian connection. One of these individuals appears to be pro-Ukrainian and is, of course, himself Ukrainian, and yet, nonetheless, the possibility is now being floated that the Russians are involved. Well, could it just possibly be that this investigation, which apparently now involves counter-terrorist police, and one wonders who exactly took that decision to instruct these police, could it just be that this investigation is already starting to go a bit off the rails? Might it not be the case that questioning these three perpetrators might be the best way to discover what the motives are? I say that because, of course, the prosecutor is now telling us that the motives of these three people remains a mystery. As I said, have they been asked to explain their motives? Anyway, I leave it at that. You can draw your own conclusions. I also find it very strange that this particular article should have been the lead story in the Financial Times for, as I said, around 24 hours, when it actually doesn't take us anywhere. Anyway, there it is. There is not really very much more to say about Ukraine-related matters at the moment. At least Ukrainian negotiation matters at the moment. The massive exchange of prisoners, the biggest since the start of the war, is now, as I understand it, almost concluded. There are still perhaps some prisoners who remain to be exchanged, but most of the prisoners apparently have now been exchanged. So that part of this operation has now been completed. Meanwhile, the war goes on, and over the last couple of days, as I discussed in a previous video, the Ukrainians launched a massive series of drone attacks on Russia. I said massive in terms of scale. To repeat again a point I've made previously, not massive in terms of effect. To repeat again, I was in St. Petersburg. St. Petersburg has also, by the way, been the target of Ukrainian drone attacks, but I saw absolutely no sign or evidence of them whilst I was there. And I got no impression that people were nervous in any way about Ukrainian drone attacks. And I have to say something, actually, rather remarkably. I never even thought about them whilst I was there. I mean, it never crossed my mind to even consider that drone attacks by Ukraine might even happen, including at the conference centre, which I was myself attending as part of the legal forum with which I participated. So that gives you a sense of how peaceful at least parts of Russia are. As I said, maybe in Moscow things are a little bit more tense. I don't know. But overall, I didn't get a sense that, as I said, there is any real sense of fear or panic anywhere, certainly in St. Petersburg, about potential Ukrainian drone attacks. So, as I said, the scale of this, I think, is being misunderstood in the West. No doubt lots and lots of drones are indeed being launched by Ukraine against Russia. But the drones are not having a huge amount of effect. Most of them get shot down or brought down by the Russian air defenses. And when drones do get through, so far they've done minimal, I would say even ephemeral damage. What the drone attacks have done is provoked a, frankly, I thought, rather tasteless comment by Dmitry Medvedev, the vice chairman of the Russian Security Council, the man who addressed the legal forum in which I participated. He used language which he's taken to using, frankly, continuously and excessively in the various comments which he makes, which I frankly dislike and think excessive. But anyway, his essential point was that the Ukrainians conduct drone attacks on Russia. They target Russian cities. Some of these drone attacks appear to be focused on civilian targets, and Western governments say absolutely nothing about them. Just as they make no comments any longer about Ukrainian assassinations carried out on Russian territory, and of course, a possible potential Ukrainian assassination carried out on EU territory in Spain. Again, I'm not preempting the results of the investigation, though I'm hearing quite interesting information about this particular individual, this former Ukrainian advisor to President Yanukovych and lawyer, which some of this I cannot disclose on this program, but I noticed that Ambassador Miroshnik of Russia, he's one of Russia's ambassadors at large. Anyway, he was speaking about the fact that the person who was killed in Spain had recently been to Kiev, that he'd had meetings with high officials, and Miroshnik speculated, and I would put the word speculate in inverted commas, maybe the Russians know more than they're saying. Anyway, speculated that Ambassador Miroshnik, that this man who was killed in Spain actually had information, papers, and those kind of things about important people in Kiev, and he was basically murdered in order to silence him. Now, I don't want to say more, but all I will say is this. I have been hearing some rather strange things about this assassination from private sources, and I found Miroshnik's comments rather interesting in light of those earlier private comments which I had heard, I will say this, from non-Russian sources. Just saying. Anyway, to move on. West has nothing to say about any of these things. A potential person killed in Spain. Maybe the Ukrainians were involved, maybe not, but nobody's rushing to any conclusions about that or pointing any fingers. We're told to wait the outcome of the investigation, which is a correct and proper thing, but as I said previously, that is not what has been done in other cases, just to say, including certain cases that happened in Britain. And nobody commenting about the fact that a Russian general was assassinated in Moscow, and that Zelensky himself and his officials seem to be proud of the fact and admitted responsibility. I say near Moscow, not in Moscow. Nobody seems to be bothered about that. Nobody concerns themselves about Ukrainian drone attacks on civilian targets in Russia. And Medvedev made the perhaps unsurprising point that this does contrast with Western responses to Russian drone and missile attacks on Ukraine. They invariably get criticized and condemned. People talk about them being excessive and disproportionate, and of course when civilians die, which is a terrible thing. That fact gets highlighted, as is the case in the leading article in The Guardian today, which mentions that 13 civilians were killed in the last big Russian missile and drone attack, the one which took place last night. And yes, civilians are killed, and that is indeed terrible. Though, given the scale of this missile and drone attack, which did take place, again, one has to note the fact, and perhaps be relieved about the fact, that the killings are, or at least appear to be, on a significantly smaller scale. So anyway, let's just talk about that missile and drone attack now. As I said, it was on a huge scale. The Guardian is saying that it was the biggest attack carried out over the course of the war. I am not sure whether that is true or not, but certainly it was a big one, and it might have been the biggest attack so far directed specifically at the city of Kiev. And the main target, at least according to the Russians, was Ukraine's industrial facilities, military industrial facilities, and aspects of its defense systems. And, well, the Ukrainians have made many claims about their success in supposedly shooting down lots of missiles and drones that the Russians launched. But it appears that the principal points of attack was the Antonov plant. I discussed it yesterday. The Antonov plant apparently has been targeted by the Russians over several days, and this may be Ukraine's biggest drone production facility. That's what some people are speculating, which would make sense. Where better to build drones than in a former aircraft factory? And also Ukraine's Patriot air defense missile system. And there's actually a rather striking video in which we see pictures of Patriot missiles being launched, presumably from the same airfield where we know that the Patriots are based, and they're being launched into the sky, and then suddenly, from the location where the Patriots appear to be launched, one sees a massive fire and explosion, suggesting that a missile detonated in that particular area, and it could be that the Russians attacked and destroyed, or at least damaged, some of the Patriot missile launchers in that particular airfield. So it could be that this is a further attempt to attack the Patriot missile system that is defending Kiev. Anyway, that's the drone missile battle. The Russians are in a much, much more powerful position to wage the drone missile war than the Ukrainians are. The Ukrainians, as I said, do minimal damage to the Russians. The Russians do massive damage to the Ukrainians, and this has been the consistent truth right through the entire war. And there are speculations, there are discussions that the Russians, in their attacks so far, specifically on Kiev, have been using only 20% of their available strength. They're testing and perhaps damaging the air defences in advance, perhaps, of the great offensive which is to come. So anyway, that was one thing that happened overnight. But overnight also we got news of further Russian advances. There's now apparently confirmation that the village of Lochnia in Sumy region has now indeed been fully captured by the Russians. Apparently the Russian Defense Ministry is confirming this. Our old friend, Andrei Marochko, Russian military commentator, says that the Russians have now entered the village of Yunakovka, which adjoins Lochnia and which is the major defense position that the Ukrainians have on the way to the city of Sumy. So it may be that the battle for Yunakovka has now indeed begun. There are also reports, in fact, again, it looks as if this has been confirmed by the Russian Defense Ministry, that the village of Stupochki, which is located south of Chasiv Yar, a major fortified village, has also passed fully under Russian control. Stupochki, it has indeed fallen, taken together with the Russian advances to the north of Chasiv Yar, reinforce my own view that Chasiv Yar, the major positions, the major Ukrainian positions in Chasiv Yar have indeed fallen, and though there's likely to be some Ukrainian positions still left in some of the micro districts around Chasiv Yar, it looks as if Chasiv Yar, the Battle of Chasiv Yar, is, as I said, effectively over. And perhaps the fastest advances at the moment that the Russians continue to carry out are in the area south of Konstantinovka. The Russians appear to be moving very fast in this area, with more and more signs that Konstantinovka, as I said, is now in effect gradually being encircled. The fall of Stupochki would obviously enable that, but the Russians have also apparently continued to put their pressure around, exert their pressure around Pokrovsk, and they appear also to be advancing rather more rapidly again westwards towards the Dnieper in the area southwest of Pokrovsk. Now, a Ukrainian official has, I think he's a parliamentarian, has actually come out and said that he does not expect that the negotiations are going to go anywhere over the course of the next couple of weeks. He anticipates a big Russian offensive in the fall, in the autumn. That probably is wrong. I expect the offensive to begin, it has in some respects already begun, with the main forces to be committed during the summer. And this official, this parliamentarian from Ukraine, said that the Russians will continue to push forward throughout the summer, probably seeking to capture more and more territory, probably pressing forward with their main battle, the battle for Pokrovsk, and the battles for Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. And then once we get to the winter, when operations begin to slow, perhaps that is when negotiations will begin, maybe from a different position, because of course the Russians will then be further advanced in Donbass. For all I know, they might have completely cleared Donbass. They might be closing in on places like Zaporozhye and Dnipro. And of course, if these tentative reports of Russian offensives in Kherson and Sumy region turn out to be true, it could be that there are big Russian advances coming in other places as well. And of course, by that point, by the late autumn, early winter, we will hopefully have clarity about the sanctions position. Perhaps by then, the Americans and the Europeans will have joined in imposing their massive sanctions. If, as I firmly expect, those sanctions prove ineffectual, that will be the point finally when the penny drops in Europe, even in Europe, that there is no form of economic pressure that can be imposed on Russia, which is going to change the pace of the Russian offensive and of the Russian advance. And maybe by then, by the autumn, we will start to see the Ukrainians and the Americans and the Europeans perhaps a bit more willing to be, as I would say, more realistic about their negotiation stance. I would just say that if we do get to that position, of course, it is highly likely, and the Russians have already warned about this, that the Russians will have further hardened upon the demands that they are making now, that they might no longer be demanding that 4 regions be transferred to Russia. They might be demanding that more regions than those 4 regions be transferred to Russia. And if they have crossed the Dnieper, for example, and are once again re-established on the currently Ukrainian west bank of the Dnieper in Kherson region, maybe, for example, by this point, they could start making claims concerning Odessa and Ukraine's Black Sea coast, and so those sort of things. I have consistently argued that delaying negotiations, I've been saying this since 2022, postponing negotiations, postponing the reckoning that must come in terms of negotiations, is a short-sighted strategy. It is much more likely to result in an escalation of Russian demands at the time when the negotiations finally take place, and the longer that they're postponed, and the longer Western governments refuse to address the underlying realities, the less of Ukraine will be left. The Russians have recently taken to making that very point themselves, but for the moment at least, there continues to be denial about it. Anyway, this is where I'm going to finish my discussions about Ukraine. Now, let me now return briefly to the topic of the Middle East. I said I would do so in my previous program. I've already discussed in a recent program why I do not take seriously claims that there is a rift between the United States and Israel, or that European government opinion is turning against Israel, or any of that. Prime Minister Netanyahu has gone out of his way to deny that there is a rift with the United States, and nobody for the moment is contradicting him. A number of reports appeared a couple of days ago about the Israelis preparing airstrikes against Iran without first getting American consent and without getting commitments of American participation. I've come round firmly to the view that no such airstrikes exclusively by Israel are in fact being prepared. I believe that these reports are intended again to influence the internal discussion in the United States, to try to get the United States to support potential Israeli airstrikes against Iran, and to bring the negotiations with Iran to a close. I think that is far more likely than anything else. So I want to make those points because I think there is a lot of misconceived hopes about this. I don't myself think that those hopes in terms of a rift between the West and Israel are true. What I do expect to start to happen at some point within the next couple of weeks is renewed pressure in the United Nations, in the Security Council, and in the General Assembly. Last year, there was a whole series of battles in the Security Council, which culminated in a resolution by the Security Council calling for a ceasefire. And it was what I said would happen, and in fact it did. And I warned that if it didn't happen, eventually the matter would be taken to the General Assembly. And for all we know, there might have been a resolution under the Uniting for Peace procedure. All of this was then put on pause because of the American election And then in the aftermath of the election, it seemed as if the Trump administration was engaging in negotiations with Israel to bring the actual conflict in Gaza, to an end. And we even had for a period an actual ceasefire in place in Gaza. And as a result, some of that pressure went away, and we saw less happening in the United Nations than we saw last year. But if the fighting continues, if the blockade currently in place continues, then I think that we will see a renewal of this pressure at the General Assembly and in the United Nations. And I predict also that the movers of this process will probably be the Gulf states, the Arab Gulf states. Quite likely, at some point, there will be a meeting of the Arab League, and we will start to see pressure start to be placed there. Now, I think, and I've always thought, that obviously this is a very long, involved process, but quite apart from what effect it might have on the situation in the Middle East, if we start to get renewed pressure in the United Nations and in the General Assembly, then inevitably it is going to weaken still further whatever remaining residual attempts the West is going to try to make to rally support diplomatically around the world in terms of putting pressure on Russia in the conflict in Ukraine. Well, anyway, we shall see whether I'm right about this, but this is where I'm going to finish my program today. As I said, shorter programs. Partly one of the reasons I'm going to say this straightforwardly is that I've realized that the upload times here are very, very much slower than I'm used to in London, and very much slower than I experienced in St. Petersburg. So I can only handle, my systems here can only handle shorter videos. So this is where I'm going to finish today's video. There'll be more from me tomorrow. Until then, have a very good day. Just to quickly remind you, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop. Links under this video. Last but not least, please remember, if you've liked this video, to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a good day.